So Major Gregory A. Weisler is the commander of the Military Intelligence Detachment for the 19th Special Forces Group stationed in Utah. Weisler has recently returned from 6 months in Djibouti, East Africa, where he served as the Director of Intelligence for the Special Operations Command and Control Element, Horn of Africa. Over a 20-year career, his assignments have included 4 years of active duty at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, U.S. Army Reserves in several intelligence, command, and training positions in Texas, Georgia, and Utah, deployments in support of combat operations for Operation Just Cause in Panama, Operations Desert Shield and Storm in Saudi Arabia, Operation Iraqi Freedom in Kuwait, and Operation Enduring Freedom in Djibouti. He's a graduate of Military Intelligence Basic and Advanced Officer courses, the Combined Arms and Services Staff School, and the Army's Airborne, Jumpmaster, and Ranger courses. In addition to a BA in Business Administration, he received an MA in International Relations from Baylor University, as well as an MA in Political Science from Emory University. He is currently enrolled at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Major Weisler has received numerous awards, including the Bronze Star Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, 4 Army Commendation Medals, and 2 Army Achievement Medals. He and his wife, the former Laurie Ann Hooper, are the parents of 3 daughters. As I mentioned today, his topic is the U.S. military in Africa, a view from Camp Lemonnier, Djibouti. Please join me in welcoming Major Gregory A. Weisler.
Does that work? Can you guys hear me? All right, good. I don't like having this in my face. Thanks, Corey, and thank all of you for being here. I appreciate especially a couple of friends and family, my wife and my brother-in-law here, and Colonel Boberg, who's the head of the Army ROTC program here, is where I've worked for a little over 9 years, and so I have a very warm spot in my heart for the Army ROTC program on this campus and BYU. I'm going to talk a little bit today. Wanted to start with, as was mentioned, I've been in the Army for over 22 years, and both in active reserve and National Guard status. And recently, from October of last year to April of this year, I was in Djibouti in East Africa, and a lot of people don't know where that is. So if you look up here, let's make this little thing point. See that little tiny little purple spot right there? That's the country of Djibouti. It's called the Horn of Africa. It's right there in the area. It's called the Horn of Africa. This little part being the Horn of Africa, Somalia. Djibouti is roughly the size of Massachusetts, so you can drive across it in about 2 hours. And I think it might be the smallest country on the continent of Africa. Before I go much further, let me state just for the record that I am not in any way representing or saying anything that represents the policy of the United States government or of the United States Army. Anything that I discuss today is my personal opinion or based on my personal experiences. So I cannot make statements for the government or the Army. Also, I want to be clear that I am not an expert on Africa. I didn't really even pay much attention to Africa until about 18 months ago when I realized I was getting ready to deploy over there. However, in my position as the intelligence director for our command there in Djibouti, it was my responsibility to be current on everything that was going on in the countries that were part of our area of responsibility. And in our area of responsibility included 16 countries in East Africa, as well as the island of Madagascar off to the southeast of the African continent. That area was equivalent to the area of the continental United States in terms of land size. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So let me see if I can make all this work now. That's not going to be what I want. Let's try it this way. Okay, so we've done the introduction. I'm going to do a crisis overview, talk a little bit about the mission of Africa Command, go over 2 or 3 of the countries depending on what kind of time we have, and then some of the ongoing concerns or problems that I think are in Africa. why should we be interested in Africa? And I'm not supposed to wander too far away from the podium. So these are some things that you might be aware of if you've read about or you might have lived through, depending on how old you are. From 1984 until 2005, there was a civil war in Sudan. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people died during the course of that war. Hundreds of thousands more were displaced. Peace agreement was reached in 2005. We'll talk a little bit more about that between northern and southern Sudan. From 1991, with the dissolution of the Somali central government, Somalia has essentially been, most of Somalia has essentially been without a government. It's been a series of civil wars or conflicts with the various clans and warlords within Somalia. 94, most of us are familiar with the Rwandan genocide, in which within 100 days, 800,000 people were killed, most of them by machete. From 1998 to 2000, a border war between Ethiopia and Eritrea killed around 300,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands more. In 98, some of the first attacks by Al-Qaeda occurred against U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. And again, in 2002, Al-Qaeda struck in Mombasa, Kenya, blowing up a motel owned by primarily Israelis, and then attempted to shoot down an Israeli airliner on that same day. And then since present, from 2003 to present, ongoing conflicts in Sudan, especially in the Darfur, Western Sudan area. And I neglected to mention up here the ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is eastern and northeastern Congo, which is pretty horrible. All of these crises, for one reason or another, have involved the international community, and many times have involved the United States. And most of these have not required direct military intervention, but they have been human disasters requiring a lot of aid, whether it's food aid or medical aid or other relief aid from the United States as well as Western Europe and much of the rest of the international community. That's one of the reasons that you're not getting me? Okay. How's that? Is that better? Okay. That's one of the reasons that in 2007, under President Bush and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, Africa Command was established as a separate regional command. I don't know how many of you are aware, but the United States military has separated the world or divided the world into, up to that point, 5 regional commands. And each of these commands was responsible for a particular region in the world. Central Command, which is in charge of Central Asia, Central and Southwest Asia, is in charge of both the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. Pacific Command, based in Hawaii, has all of Eastern Asia and the Pacific Rim countries. AFRICOM, or the Africa itself, was split up between European Command, Central Command, and at what they called Atlantic Command, or North America, which was based in North America for up until 2007, at which time, because of the history of the things that are going on in Africa and the fact that the instability that's inherent in a lot of places in Africa has led to an increase in terrorist organizations and an increase in their lethality. Because of those several reasons, it was decided to focus on Africa and set up a separate regional command. And the purpose of the command in Africa, which stood up in 2008, is as you see here on the screen. Build partner security capacity with the various countries in Africa, work in concert with those countries that are willing to partner with us, reinforce success with operations that have had success. Many of these are medical type operations. Address transnational challenges, and those specifically are international terrorism and international narcotics trafficking, and then respond to crises where they occur. Africa Command is different than all the other previous regional military commands. Africa Command is more than half made up of other civilian agencies. In fact, when Corey was talking a little bit earlier about careers in social sciences and political science, half of what would normally be the intelligence directorate of one of these commands, a regional command, in the case of AFRICOM, is an intelligence and knowledge directorate. So half of it is based solely on knowledge and is made up of social scientists, anthropologists, political scientists, who all do research and publish with a focus on helping the governments in Africa. So there are several positions within that command that hire graduate students specifically to work on the problems associated with Africa. Just thought I'd throw in that little sales pitch there. General Ward, and the primary mission of AFRICOM is more diplomatic than it is military. And I'll let you just read General Ward's statement here. You can kind of get the gist of what he is talking about. As I mentioned, it's the first regional command with a large civilian component. It incorporates members. In fact, one of the deputy commanders of the command is an ambassador from the Department of State, and it incorporates other leaders from the U.S. Agency for International Development and other government agencies. Its primary mission is diplomatic, not military, and as it states there at the end, the belief is that by helping African nations achieve stability, that peace will be a natural result. This is one of the things, I'll orient you a little bit to the continent. This is one of the things that I know that I wasn't really particularly aware of. So we'll talk a little bit about size. These are, let's see if I can do this with my mouse here. These are on scale. So if you can kind of take a look at the size of Africa. Where's my mouse? The size of Africa when you compare it to all of North America. You can fit the continental United States, the 48 states in the continental United States will fit 3+ times into the continent of Africa. So it's huge. And a lot of times I didn't really get that. Especially when I'm parked way over on the east edge over there in Djibouti, when we try to go someplace, it's like trying to get across the United States. We call it the tyranny of distance when we're there. It's just incredible how much effort it takes to go from one place to another. And the highways like we have, crisscrossing the United States don't exist in the same way. So getting places, especially if you've got to go more than 100 miles, most of the time you have to fly, and the distances are you're going to be in planes for several hours. Make sure I covered all. This just kind of shows you a little bit of the natural relief. One of the things that I found interesting is Djibouti is right up here, just across from Yemen. It happens to be at the intersection of 3 continental plates. You have the Arabian Plate, the Africa Plate, and the Indian Ocean Plate. And the Great Continental, or the Great Rift, or the Rift Valley, it runs right, and if you follow the mouse, it just kind of runs right down through there. It's a very interesting geographical feature, and geographical features have a lot to do with how ethnicities, where different ethnic groups ended up in Africa and language patterns. And we'll have a chance to look at that in a minute. Some of the other very interesting things about Africa, how many in here have a cell phone, iPhone, Droid? Raise your hand if you got one. There are some very interesting and rare elements that are being used now. One of them is called tantalum, and one of the main places to get tantalum is out of Central Africa. In fact, it's one of the few places in the world that you can get it. We've all heard about blood diamonds, right? Familiar with the movie or the idea? Well, a lot of the ongoing conflict in Central Africa and the Democratic Republic of the Congo is due to the extraction of these scarce resources. It's not just diamonds, and it's not just gold. Tantalum and cobalt and platinum related metals and compounds are all extracted out of Africa. They're all very rare, and they're all in high demand because they're all used in microcapacitors and in circuit boards and all the things that are being built for our technology. So you may have in your phone, you may have blood tantalum in your iPhone, so, or the equivalent of it. This map just kind of shows a little bit of the difference. This shows bands of vegetation, but you can tell the Sahara is in the north, and then this area right here where you have the light green and the tan band is called the Trans-Sahel. That's the transition area between the desert and the deep, where'd my mouse go? And the triple tier jungle or deep canopy rainforest. And that area is also the conflict zone between the Muslim north and the Christian or animist south. So a lot of ethnic conflict runs through all of these countries from east to west. And that conflict has a religious base to it as well. Now, this is one of the things that I find most fascinating about Africa. Africa has over 1,000 distinct ethnic groups speaking over 700 different distinct languages. In a sense, where lines were drawn to make countries was purely arbitrary and did not pay any attention to ethnic majorities or language or cultural centers. The lines were primarily drawn by the colonizers, the European countries that colonized Africa. What you're seeing here in the various color schemes, there are 7 different main language groups, but you can see how diverse they are and how they spread out. You can also see how some of them end up being islands or ethnic islands, completely away from where their original heritage might have been. This also contributes to a lot of the ethnic conflict within Africa. Let's turn now to Somalia. One of the primary reasons for our interest, American interest in Somalia, or in Africa. Just point real quick back over here to the map on the side. You can see where I was in Djibouti, that nice yellow country right there, that on the horn, that's Somalia, and then Ethiopia there to the west. So our little camp was actually about 8 miles away from the border of northern Somalia. Somalia right now has no central government. What happened after 1991 is the clans and the groups up here in northwest Somalia established their own government and call it Somaliland. The capital is here in Hargeisa. 2 or 3 years later, the clans that were in charge of that kind of ran northeastern Somalia established a central government and call it Puntland, and its capital is up here in Busaso. This area here, the Sanag and Sul, is an area of conflict. Both governments claim this area, and they occasionally have border conflicts over it. From Galkayo south, there is no central government. The United States, along with the European Union and a bunch of other international actors, has been behind a government established in Mogadishu called the Transitional Federal Government, which wants to be the central government for all of Somalia. It has about 400 to 500 elected legislators, most of whom live in Kenya, won't even come to Mogadishu because they're afraid that they'll get killed if they go there. And then the rest of the country itself, from, as I said, from Galkayo south, is basically a war zone. In the last
2 years, an Islamic fundamentalist movement called Al-Shabaab has risen to power, and they control most of this area. They've been able to control the area by making agreements with some of the other clans run by other types of militia. They're currently battling forces supporting the Transitional Federal Government, or TFG, in Mogadishu, as well as forces along the border with Ethiopia. Ethiopia has sent its military into Somalia on numerous occasions to fight against Islamic fundamentalism. I'll talk a little bit more about why they care in a minute. Why this is important, two reasons. Al-Qaeda uses Somalia as one of its principal training grounds. Hundreds of what we call foreign fighters transition through Somalia into training camps on a regular basis. And the training camps are set up by Al-Shabaab, and they're protected by Al-Shabaab, and they have a very nice relationship. Al-Shabaab takes some of the training that the Al-Qaeda leadership brings to them and provides them training area for Al-Qaeda to train. Al-Shabaab has adopted a number of Al-Qaeda tactics, including suicide bombings, IEDs, and vehicle bombings. And until July of this year, they had concentrated all of that within Somalia, so they hadn't exported any of those terrorist techniques. In July, however, they conducted bombings in Kampala, Uganda. And Al-Shabaab did this because Uganda, along with Ethiopia, Djibouti, Burundi, and Rwanda, are providing forces and training to support the transitional government in Mogadishu. Those forces are called AMISOM, and I'm trying to remember, it's the African military mission in Somalia. And those forces are provided primarily by Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda. And they're in Mogadishu, and they own about a third of Mogadishu. Al-Shabaab owns the other 2/3 of Mogadishu, so there's fighting that goes on back and forth. And Al-Shabaab is very angry about the fact that foreigners are in Mogadishu supporting that government. And so they have threatened for a number of years that they would attack some of these other countries supporting these forces. And they never did so until July of this year. One of the other big things that you might have read about in the last couple of years is the piracy. And the reason for piracy is, and what's very interesting about this is the pirates come out of Puntland, or out of the northeast coast of Somalia, and they venture all the way out here in the Indian Ocean, all the way down here into the Seychelles. So they'll go out hundreds of miles, grab a cargo vessel, take over a cargo vessel and hold it ransom, usually for somewhere between $1 and $5 million. And they've been doing this for a number of years, but this practice really started probably about 10 years ago and has gotten worse progressively every year until this last year was probably the worst year of all. We have, NATO has lots of naval forces, and we've provided naval forces to escort ships through the Gulf of Aden and on the main shipping lanes through the Indian Ocean, but we can't protect all of them. And the way that the Somali pirates operate is they will go out in skiffs and grab a smaller dhow, probably about 100-foot long dhow that transits. Where'd my mouse go? Dhows transit all the way from East Africa up to Yemen and across over to India. There's a regular trade that's been going on for thousands of years. In fact, for all of us that are LDS, those dhows have been operating since probably around the time of Christ and even before. There's regular shipping that goes on across there. But the Somali pirates will get on a couple of skiffs, small just boats with an outboard motor on it. They'll take over one of these dhows. They'll tie their skiffs to the dhow and use it as a mothership, and they'll take the dhow out into the ocean and wait for a passing ship to come by. Then they'll send the skiffs out, and you can't see the skiffs in the water until they're very close. And then they'll board a ship, and then they'll take the ship back to off the coast of Somalia, make a phone call, and say, hey, you can have your ship back when you bring us some ransom. And there are probably between 20 and 40 ships a year that get ransomed this way. So needless to say, it creates a lot of instability and a lot of concern and slows down some of the trade that could be going through this area. Let me go back really quick. Just to give you an idea of what the unrest in Somalia has caused in terms of what the human cost has been. Within Somalia itself, you have these largest circles are 300,000. These next circles are 100,000, and these ones down here are about 30,000. That's the number of displaced people that are displaced from where their homes are, where they grew up or where their families are from, just based on internally. On the left-hand side, you can see where the population of refugees that have left Somalia trying to get away from the fighting, and that population, and that total is over 600,000 people. It's surprising how many of them end up here in Yemen. Yemen is the passageway from Yemen to Djibouti is less than 15 miles across that water right there. A lot of Somalis will actually move through Somalia, from southern Somalia up through Ethiopia or northern Somalia into Djibouti, and then board dhows and go across. So there's a lot of human trafficking back and forth across the water there. So all of these things have, they have a human cost. They have a cost in terms of what it costs the various shipping companies and navies and trying to protect all the ships that are in there. And that is, of course, associated with military and defense costs, and it increases the cost of goods as well. And finally, because Al-Shabaab has been supporting Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda type groups in exporting terrorism, it's become a very serious military concern, not just for the United States, but for most of the countries in Western Europe as well. Al-Shabaab is associated with Al-Qaeda and has also been associated with attacks in the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. So it's a continued problem. Ethiopia, as I mentioned, has attacked and gone into Somalia on a number of occasions because of their concern that Al-Shabaab and others are exporting Islamic fundamentalism into Ethiopia and creating unrest there. All right. I'm going to talk briefly about two more things because I wanted to have time for you guys to ask some questions if you had them. Sudan, we're familiar with. There's been 2 civil wars in Sudan. The one that most of you are probably familiar with is the civil war in Darfur. But prior to Darfur, the fighting started between North and South. And you can see on this map here, this is the proposed division between North and South. It's also, if we go back to that earlier map where the Trans-Sahel, the transition between the Sahara and moving down into the more vegetated area, it's also follows almost exactly that line. To the north is primarily Arabic there's ethnic Arabs, and then Muslim-speaking black Africans, and then in the south is mostly Christian and animist African. So that line represents the difference between the southern kind of Christian and animist and the northern Muslim. And there's very different ethnic groups on either side of that line as well. That civil war went for almost 20 years. Millions perished in the course of that. Millions more were displaced. In 2005, a comprehensive peace agreement was reached with the assistance and encouragement of the United States as part of that negotiating process, and guaranteed southern Sudan that they would have the right to vote for secession in 2011. That vote's to take place this January 9th. There's a lot of military, of course we're paying very close attention because we're trying to figure out whether they're going to go to war again. Both the North and South have said that they'll live by whatever the vote is, but no one has an accurate census of the South. so no one knows how many people will actually there that will actually vote. So when you don't have a census, it's very difficult to count votes and determine whether you had a majority or not. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. We've been watching that very closely. And then if you go to the west, this is northern Darfur and southern Darfur. Again, the tribal groups in the west felt like they've been disenfranchised. They're ethnically different from the more Arabic center in Khartoum and the government in Khartoum. And they've been fighting since 2003. And there's been, again, hundreds of thousands displaced and accusations which have been more or less validated that the president of Sudan and his government have been ethnically cleansing or killing off ethnically different people in Darfur. President Bashir, the president of Sudan, has been indicted by the International Criminal Court as a war criminal and crimes against humanity and genocide. Yet he remains, in fact, he was just reelected president this year. So one of the other reasons why there's a reluctance of the North to give up the South as a separate country. If you look to the right, all that purple area there in the bottom right on the right-hand map are oil fields. All of the revenue for the oil fields, of course, goes to the government in the North, even though all the oil fields are in the South. So you can see why there might be some additional issues when it comes to them being able to secede and create a separate government. Might be interested to know that the principal consumer of that oil is China. We'll talk a little bit more about China in a minute. Talk a little bit about Democratic Republic of the Congo. Since 1996, the civil war ongoing civil wars and ethnic conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo have killed over 6 million people. Tens of thousands continue to die each year. If any of you have spent any time reading about child warriors, what happens often are the various militias or various military groups in this region, as they go into villages, they'll kill the parents, they'll make the children watch, they'll take... They'll often make the children kill their own parents, placing a gun in their hands, and then they'll incorporate them into their armies. This occurs all through Central and Northern Africa. Little girls are taken and raped repeatedly, and most of the time will die from infection from that abuse. And this is ongoing. You can read story after story after story about that occurring in this region. A lot of this unrest began with the Rwandan genocide in 1994. You'll notice that let's see if I can point it out right here. This little spot right here is Rwanda. This little spot is Burundi. Ethnic Tutsi and Hutu had conflict here. Many of the Hutu that were part of the genocide, when the Tutsi regained control, the Hutu fled into Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. Once they were there, they continued fighting and trying to gain control. Of course, they need to fund themselves, and so that's where some of the terms for blood diamonds and some of the other natural resources that they get control of, they extract, they then they sell, and then they turn around and use that money to buy weapons to continue fighting. All of the ethnic groups in this region, all the way up through here's Sudan, here's Uganda, continue fighting. These lines show various amounts of displaced people that number in the millions. And again, there's no real support there. It's very difficult to get aid into that. There are a lot of international aid agencies trying to get aid in there, and there's a lot of there's some effort for military. The UN has its largest military mission is in The Democratic Republic of the Congo, it numbers about 19,000. But when you consider that they're outnumbered probably 20 to 1 with the various militias and various other groups in northern and northeastern Congo, they really can do very little except protect themselves in whatever villages they happen to be near. In 1997, Laurent Kabila was able to gain control of the government over here in Kinshasa, so he became the president of Democratic Republic of the Congo. I just call it DROC for short, or DRC. He was killed by one of his bodyguards in 2001. His son, who was then only 30 years old, Joseph Kabila, took over. Now his son is a very, I kind of admire his son because his son has a vision of bringing peace, and within 2 years of being president was able to negotiate a number of peace deals. And so his effort, I mean, my sense is that he really wants to bring peace and prosperity to his country. The problem is he doesn't have the money to do it, or the ability to do that very well. Most of the military for the government itself doesn't get paid on a regular basis. And the farther out the various units are, as you move away from Kinshasa and get out here into the northern and northeastern Congo, less likely it is for you to get paid. And after you've gone without pay for a long time, the tendency is for military groups to go out into the nearby villages and take what they need. So it's a hard area. It's very unstable, and it's a hard problem to solve. Just real quickly, wanted to talk about Ethiopia. Some of the ethnic tensions there. There are 9 main ethnic groups in Ethiopia. The Amhara and the Oromo are the 2 biggest groups, but Ethiopia has been run since 1994 by a guy who is Tigrayan, who is from an ethnic group that comprises only 6% of the population of Ethiopia. Here's another example. If you take a look at, oops, that didn't go right. If you take a look at this relief map on the west, you can see the Ethiopian highland and mountains in the center here. Addis Ababa, the capital, sits at about 6,000 feet, so there's nice highlands and a nice range of mountains that run here. As you move down into the east, you move down into the coastal desert, which is almost all ethnic Somali. And the ethnic Amhara and Oromo peoples are in the west. They're mostly Christian. In the north and the east is mostly Islamic. And then you have groups in the southwest that kind of came out of the jungle and moving north that are mostly animist. And then you can see how that's reflected in these in the various language patterns here, the ethnic patterns. You have the Somali peoples to the east, the Amhara and the Tigrayans to the north, and you have this other very diverse group to the west. So one country has all of these different languages and ethnic groups that it has to try and satisfy. One of the things that I didn't really ever have an appreciation for at all, and I don't think that a lot of us do as Americans, we grow up in this country not really having an allegiance to a particular tribe or a particular people, right? I mean, we know that we're family, we do our genealogy if we're LDS, and we kind of know that kind of thing. But because of the way the United States was created, we don't have separate tribal groups and separate ethnic and linguistic traditions. Africa and Asia do, and there's centuries, even millennia old differences. And these differences are very difficult to reconcile. So when somebody gets into power, or they get into power, their allegiance is first to their family, and is next to their tribe or their clan, and then by extension, by extension, the larger clan or larger tribe. So what I saw in every single country within the 16 countries that we had responsibility for, with the exception of Eritrea, which doesn't hold elections, most of these countries are constitutional democracies. In other words, they have a constitution that sets it up as a democracy where they have elected representatives and they hold regular elections. In almost none of those have there been a peaceful transition of power from one president to the next. In fact, most of them, whoever does get in power will get reelected if the Constitution allows it, up until the term, to whatever the term limit is, and then they spend the next couple of years trying to get the Constitution changed to allow them to be reelected. That just happened in Djibouti. The president of Djibouti just got elected to his third term because he was able to get the Constitution changed to allow for a third term. So the same thing goes on in Ethiopia. The president there in Ethiopia was just reelected for his third term. And again, he represents a minority. Most of the opposition political parties are ethnically based. So you have opposition parties for the different ethnic groups. It's very difficult to get cooperation across ethnic groups. So you see that, and you see that same pattern throughout Africa, but I especially noticed it in East Africa. Just last, real quickly, we talked a little bit about terrorism and drug trafficking. If you look at, kind of go back over here to the map on the wall right here, it's distorted a little bit because it's flat, but the distance here from Brazil to West Africa is actually much closer than it is from here to the northern United States. So a lot of drug trafficking is actually now going from South America over to West Africa and then back to the United States or on to Europe. Similarly, the drugs that come out of Afghanistan and Central and Southern Asia come across the Indian Ocean into Eastern Africa and then around, by ship either into Europe or around back over to the Americas. Some of the largest port facilities for moving containerized shipping are now in Africa. In fact, one of the largest is in Djibouti. One of the reasons is Ethiopia is a landlocked state, so all of its trade comes through Djibouti and through the port there in Djibouti, which is pretty much the only reason Djibouti continues to exist, I think, as a separate country. We talked about ethnic tensions, election cycles. Almost every election cycle is associated with has election-related violence with it because of the groups that are not represented. They're disenfranchised, and they feel left out, and so there's often election-related violence. I mentioned China. China is probably the single biggest investor in Africa, and they invest with anybody because they don't have any restrictions about human rights and human rights violations. A lot of investment that we might have in Africa, or our corporations might have in Africa, are limited because of our congressional mandate to not work with governments or not invest where there are human rights violations or potential human rights violations. What that does, in one sense, is open the door for other countries to invest that don't have those same limitations. China doesn't care about what goes on in a particular country because as far as they're concerned, it's that country's business, not theirs. What they do want, they want those natural resources because China is the single fastest and biggest growing economy in the world, and they are fast becoming a modernized economy similar to ours, a consumer-based economy, and they need those resources. They need the oil, they need the various minerals, and they're making deals to develop infrastructure to extract them. And finally, food instability. I think I have the map right here. Just in the Horn of Africa, just in this area, 50 years ago, 1 million people lived here. Now 70 million people live here. This area was able to support 1 million people because they were primarily nomadic. So they had herds and they primarily just moved around. They were nomadic. With the institution of governments and borders, and with the increase in technology, we're able now to provide water, and now they're less able to move. So populations have increased, but the ability for the land to support that increase, the increased demand for food, has not. The terrain there simply doesn't support it. It's primarily desert. Most of that area is desert. So whenever there's a drought, it results in famine, and so you get cycles of famine where hundreds of thousands or millions of people end up being at risk for starvation. So that problem that cycle will just continue, probably get worse. So some of the things that happen with increase in population are the demands on some of this terrain or some of this geography that has never been able to sustain that in the past. And that also contributes to instability between groups as they demand resources. Okay, I went over and I wanted to have time for questions, so what do you want me to do, Corey?
Thank you to those who need to go, and we'll have a few questions. So thanks. And then if those of you who do want to ask questions or stay for a minute, you're welcome to.
Well, what I want to know is, I know how Somalia feels about the United States, but what about Djibouti and Eritrea? Is there enough people there who don't hate us?
Yeah, that's a good question. In Djibouti, for the most part, they welcome the United States. The French have been there for a long time, and Djibouti actually opened up a part of that base there to us, primarily I think for income, but also because our presence there helps guarantee their continued sovereignty. Eritrea would like to take over northern Djibouti. Ethiopia, of course, would like to incorporate all of Djibouti. And Somalia would probably like to have Djibouti because most of the people in Djibouti are ethnic Somali. Djibouti itself is divided by two ethnic groups. You have the Afar in the north and the Isa in the south. And I can tell you a story about how that goes. But the president in power is Isa, and so most of the people in government are Isa, and the Afar feel disenfranchised. Eritrea hates the United States and hates pretty much just about everybody. The president of Eritrea is created a cult of personality very similar to Kim Jong-il in North Korea. So it's a very similar problem. People are leaving Eritrea by the thousands trying to escape, and he's got his military along the border trying to shoot people trying to leave. So.
Most of them work at Los Angeles Airport. I worked there a long time. I got to know them. And they would always tell me, oh, you should come with us. It's safe.
Eritrea wasn't bad until probably this last year, and now the paranoia has gotten to the point where anybody that's especially U.S. is viewed as a potential spy, and so they're not welcoming at all. Yeah, I mean it's beautiful along the coast there, though. Mm-hmm.
Do you want to know our majors? Is that what you said? Okay. My name's Brian. I'm a geography major. And the other week in the New York Times, they ran an article about different pirate factions being incorporated into either, was it the Shabab or?
Al-Shabaab, yeah.
Al-Shabaab or the government, and they're taking whoever they can get. And along with that comes financing.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the United States and different military efforts to cut off the pirates, that implies perhaps that the financing for the different factions will be hurt. Will that affect like attacks on Americans from or feelings being hurt from the central government that we're backing?
We were watching pretty closely and trying to figure out, and one of them was whether or not the money that the pirates were bringing in was being used to fund Al-Shabaab. And from what we could tell, in most cases it was not. In other words, the pirates were further up in the northeast. Now, understand, it's so hard for us to understand. It's the closest parallel we have it in that run things. And they make agreements. And if I let you do this, then you pay me a little bit. And if you let me do this, then I'll pay you a little bit. And that's how it works. That's how these clans work. I mean, that's essentially all they are is large families. and they control particular parts of Somalia or territories. The guys in the northeast, up near the Horn portion of it, that's where most of the pirate operations. So you know that they're paying off the central government of Puntland in order to be able to continue their operations. That's just what they do. They offer jobs to all the poor fishermen that don't have jobs. They say, hey, look, we'll pay you this much if you go out with us for the next month. Whatever we get, this is your cut. It might only be, they might bring in a take of $2 million or $3 million ransom. They'll give these guys maybe a couple of $1,000s. But when your annual income is maybe $100, a couple of $1,000 for a month's worth of work is worth it. And so they'll take the risk. They'll go. The piracy problem erupted because when the central government of Somalia went away, there was nobody to protect the waters for fishermen. You saw Somalia, it's almost all coastal. Most of that country lives off of the fishing. And with no navy to protect their fishing waters, all the other larger countries, all the way from East Asia, from Korea, all the way around, came in there and commercial fishing sucked up all the fish. So these guys felt like they could not continue to survive and support their families, so they turned to piracy. At least that's the excuse that they're going with. So for the most part, there's no direct connection between piracy and Al-Shabaab, but there are clearly indirect connections between the various clans and where piracy, which pirate faction and where they're based and who they're paying off for the right to operate out of that area. Does that answer your question, kind of? Okay.
My name's Adam. I'm an international relations major. We talked a lot about the east side of the African continent and the oil fields in Sudan. I was wondering about the west coast, like the Niger Delta. Does the U.S. military have any presence in regulating that area or protecting that area?
We do. Africa Command, the only actual forward base that we have in Africa is in Djibouti. That's the only area that we lease and actually have a base on, and it's a very small base, not more than probably 2,000 military people there at any one time. But the focus of that base in Djibouti is the Horn of Africa or East Africa, that was my focus there. AFRICOM, of course, has all of Africa. There is a joint task force that is concerned with West Africa, and there's a couple of different task forces. One of them is for counter-narcotics trafficking, where the military is working with the FBI, DEA, and other government agencies, as well as with other countries in Western Europe, to try and get a fix on controlling the drug trafficking coming in and around and through West Africa. Also not in Nigeria, but in northern Nigeria, especially up in Niger, Mali, and southern and Mauritania, and in southern Algeria, what we call Al-Qaeda IM, or the Al-Qaeda from the Maghreb region, is operating in that area, and they've been kidnapping tourists and aid workers and holding them ransom on a regular basis for the past few years. We have a military. We don't have a presence there in the sense that we have a permanent presence, but our military is regularly there to help train the counterterrorist forces of those various countries. In fact, there's a young man here who just left who was in Mali last year doing just that with 10th Special Forces Group. So the idea of Africa Command is that we do joint training operations with the militaries that want to work with us, and most of them, especially as they see these different groups creating instability within their own countries, most of them want our assistance, and so they welcome us and they'll train with us, and we help train them to be better and work with them.
All right. Any other burning questions?
I just have one really quick.
Oh, okay. I think we had. Go ahead. I think we have this young lady, and then that young man, and then all three of you raise your hand at the same time.
I'm actually a human development major, and I just had a question. You talked about social scientists, and it's sad that I feel like only at universities do we come to understand or even get involved in kind of politics or like issues such as this. Like the general populace doesn't even have an idea that this is going on. And so as we leave BYU, how can we as citizens help our neighbors become more aware of issues like this? Or not that we necessarily want to create paranoia like you were talking about earlier, but more of a healthy sense and awareness of just being aware and being more supportive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, BYU has a unique mission, and it wasn't very long ago that both, I think, the prophet and the president of the university suggested to students that we needed to be more service-oriented, that we needed to, instead of being focused on going out and getting careers where we're going to make a bunch of money, that we go out and find careers where we can help in the world, which I think, is clearly inspired and should be the mission of this university. I discovered, working there and working with some of the people that I worked with there, there are some great men and women that are social scientists and anthropologists that got involved with different aid organizations and the Peace Corps and different things, and went there, learned the language, loved the people, and for whatever reason ended up working for Africa Command. But again, the focus is to come back and do the studies and figure out how to help them with various things, whether it's development, economic development or agricultural development, whatever it is. I discovered just a couple of weeks ago doing some other research, a great website, I think it's reliefweb.org or something. I have it on my computer, but it has pages and pages of maps and reports from all the various relief organizations in the world, and you can just scroll through all the ones that are focused on Africa. It's difficult in our country. Our country is self-centered, and we're short-sighted. I mean, we need it now, and we don't want to deal with problems that are probably decades in the solving. I mean, one of the things that's kind of depressing about Africa as you look at it is that many of these problems appear intractable. I mean, they appear unsolvable. But there are millions there's 1 billion people in the continent of Africa now, and most of them are suffering in some way or another. So it is, and the church is growing there, and they welcome the church there. The mission president from Uganda came over to see us in Djibouti and was talking about the growth of the church. So there are tremendous opportunities for service there, and whether that's service through the church or through an aid organization, there are opportunities to do that and to help make the world and make that part of the world better. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Hi, my name is Addison. I'm actually a civil engineering major, but I just got back from a mission to Madagascar. And you said that Madagascar was in your area of purview. I was wondering, this might have been predated your service there, but Madagascar went through a small coup in January, February of '09, and I just wanted to having lived through it, I wanted to know what the U.S.'s view and take on that whole situation was, if you're knowledgeable on the fact.
I actually didn't pay very much attention to Madagascar, and primarily because it was relatively stable. I mean, I think if I recall, most of the people there aren't exactly pleased with the way that things turned out there, but my understanding is that they are moving pretty rapidly back towards having elections. I'm not positive on that, but I think that was the effort. The Comoros and some of the other islands north of that are having some pretty serious problems with one guy who was supposed to rotate out of government and decided to stay. So the power sharing agreement didn't share there.
Okay, just to go along with that, just as your general opinion, what is it going to take to, not to quote fix Africa, but what, in your opinion, what kind of things are actually going to help solve the problems there? Is it a military? I mean, is it aid?
No, there's a couple of, I think there's a couple of things to think about. There's been some very good suggestions actually in the media in the past few months. There's a couple of good ones that I remember on NPR. You have to figure out. There's a couple of things you have to figure out. One is how to get whoever is in power, in charge, to share, not only share power, but share the wealth, okay? Nigeria is an example, Sudan is another example, Ethiopia is another example, where there are resources being extracted, oil, and most of the money for that goes into the hands of the few. It's not distributed to the population as a whole. They don't benefit as a whole. Consequently, they don't have a voice. So one of the suggestions is to figure out a way to try and distribute the wealth more evenly so that everybody has access to it and can benefit from it. I really believe, along with the idea of AFRICOM, the idea of AFRICOM's mission is that if you can bring economic and political stability to a country, you're gonna do away with a lot of these other things that create terrorist groups and drug trafficking and some of these other things. One of the things that the U.S. military, I think, has been pretty good at is, when working with other militaries, is setting the example of a non-political military. It's not always easy and not always successful, but that's just a part of our ethos, that we try to teach that it's not the role of the military to run the government. It's the role of the military to protect the government. So continue to reinforce that message and reinforce the message of government's responsibility to serve its people rather than serve a privileged few. Those are the real problems. We benefited a lot as a nation because when we came here, all different ethnicities came and essentially blended. And that has not occurred there. So I think that's one of the biggest problems, is figuring out how to work on that tolerance issue.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.